So I had a few of you guys comment on my Flash Season 9 video asking me why I wasn't originally planning to watch this movie, and you guys told me that just because the show was bad, it wasn't fair to assume the Flash movie would also be bad, so I shouldn't immediately write this film off just because it's about the Flash. But I can assure you guys that just because the show is garbage doesn't mean I've lost interest in the superhero himself. In fact, there was a time, for many years there, where I was actually looking forward to this film because I think the Flash is a really cool character and I've been wanting to see a good movie with him ever since I originally fell in love with the show. Especially as the show went on and continued to break my heart, I started really wanting this movie to come out just on the off chance that it might actually tell a good story with the character of Barry Allen. I mean, I knew the chances of that were slim considering this is still a DCEU movie, but nothing wrong with having a little faith, right?
Faith, Alfred. Faith.
But then, of course, this film went through so much production hell that at a certain point, I sort of just figured it was never actually coming out. I mean, just to give you guys an idea of how long we've been hearing about this movie, it was announced when the CW show was in its infancy, and it's only just now coming out, a few weeks after the show finished its 9-season run. This film has gone through so many different iterations in the background literally since the very beginning of the DCEU, with multiple different writers and directors coming and going. And with everything that's been going on with Ezra Miller these last few years, it pretty much seemed like a done deal that this was never seeing the light of day. Which is why, when the trailers started rolling out and it was confirmed to actually still be happening, I'd pretty much already made my peace with the idea that I was never gonna see it. Add all that to the fact that the trailers made this look like an overall bad film set in a dead universe, and you can see why there wasn't all that much incentive for me to check it out, right? And by the looks of the box office numbers, I can definitely say that that was a sentiment shared by many. But out of sheer morbid curiosity, I decided to watch it. I pirated it, of course. Again, Ezra Miller is a terrible person, and Warner Brothers doesn't deserve my money for continuing to parade that maniac around on the red carpet after all the horrible shit they did. I'm never paying for a single one of their products ever again for a myriad of principled reasons, least of all this one. But yeah, I checked the movie out, and surprise, surprise, it was pretty bad. To be fair, I was kind of expecting, like, the worst movie ever made, the way a lot of people on Twitter have been talking about it, and again, by the looks of the trailers. But while it's not good by any means and has an extremely nonsensical plot that we're gonna break down, it's not as bad as I kept hearing. I wouldn't even call it the worst DCEU film, it's just your typical really bad movie. And on the other end of things, I can absolutely see why I've heard a lot of people call this movie fun, because it does have a certain energy to it that you just can't help being entertained. If I'm being completely honest, I actually kinda like parts of it. I think there are some decent character moments throughout the film that we're gonna get into, and while they're not necessarily anything special, they're at least kinda good. But don't get me wrong, these little moments are few and far between, and there's a lot of horrendous shit in the middle of it all, so let's waste no more time getting into it. I'm not gonna bother going through it chronologically and picking apart every scene because I don't feel like spending the next 6 months working on this video, and because this is a movie that's kinda hard to do that for because of the way it's structured and the multitude of things that it establishes. The biggest example, of course, being the way time travel is explained to operate, which we're gonna get into later. Right now, what I want to do is quickly establish exactly which continuity this film is supposed to be set in, because with the DCEU, that's a little bit complicated. For those of you who don't know, Zack Snyder was originally the one in charge of making the Justice League film that came out in 2017, but he eventually had to step away from the project due to the tragic death of his daughter. And so Joss Whedon stepped in and reworked the film, presumably to his liking and to the liking of the studio, which is what got released into theaters. However, since then, Snyder fans have been clamoring to see the original version of the film that we would have gotten had Zack been able to bring his vision to life, and demanded the release of the Snyder Cut. Eventually, Zack Snyder's Justice League was delivered on HBO Max in 2021, and it followed the continuity of the previous two films in Snyder's trilogy, Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, as well as any of the films that came out before the 2017 Justice League, like Wonder Woman and Suicide Squad. But it was, for all intents and purposes, part of its own separate continuity, building toward a future that would never be put to screen, and which doesn't mesh with anything put out in the DCEU post-Justice League. Which means that there are effectively two separate timelines in the DC Extended Universe, the Snyderverse and the official DCEU, which, as I understood it, was everything except the Snyder Cut. Man of Steel and BVS led into the Whedon Cut, dubbed by fans as Justice League, and the films that came out from then on, from Aquaman to Black Adam, were all part of the same universe and followed the canon established in Justice League. And all that's important to understand because there are multiple moments in this film that reference events that happened in the Snyder Cut that didn't happen in Justice League, which would have to mean that it follows the canon of that film. film. For instance, when Barry's explaining to Bruce that he managed to travel back in time earlier that day, Bruce says, like in Pazharnov, which is where the final battle against Steppenwolf takes place. In Justice League, Barry never does any time travel shenanigans at any point, and when they're fighting Steppenwolf in Russia, he's helping get a family to safety. What he and Bruce are referencing only happened in the Snyder Cut, the iconic scene where he turns back time by a few seconds to stop the entire world from being destroyed. There's also a part where he's traveling through time looking at his memories, and we see the Aquaman pointing meme, which also only happens in the Snyder Cut. Now, it's hit or miss whether this film actually maintains this continuity with the Snyder Cut, as with basically anything in this goddamn franchise. For example, this film establishes a rule that Barry can't move other people at hyperspeeds because it would cause them to vomit uncontrollably and could potentially even kill them via whiplash, which is exactly how it seemed to be portrayed when he's helping get the hostages to safety in his first encounter with Steppenwolf. He's helping Cyborg get them to the roof, but is actively avoiding moving them himself. Unlike in Justice League, where he has no qualms against speeding the hostages out of harm's way, and it doesn't seem to have an adverse effect on any of them. Of course, in both BVS and Suicide Squad, we have examples of Barry running into people at hyperspeeds and knocking them out without it seeming to have any serious effect on them physically, so really it's a contradiction either way, but that's just DC for ya. They never can seem to keep their ducks in a row. What are you gonna do? At least it's consistent with the Snyder Cut. Alternatively, what's not consistent with the Snyder Cut is the fact that Iris doesn't seem to realize Barry is the Flash, despite the fact that he saved her life at super speed, and she very clearly saw his face before he ran off. This film also acts like they apparently went to college together, which means that not only has she seen his face, but by that point, she would have known him by name and would have been able to figure out how to find him. But instead, when they meet up in this movie, she doesn't seem to have a clue, apparently. And there are other smaller continuity issues generally with the way his powers are depicted throughout the different films. Like, this movie makes a huge point to show us that running at super speed generates a lot of friction and will set your clothes on fire, which is why Barry advises his alternate self not to do that. But again, in the same scene where he saves Iris, he's wearing his normal civilian clothes. His shoes break apart, but for some reason his clothes are perfectly intact, which is really a problem with consistency within itself, but it tells us that this version of the Flash doesn't have to worry about burning off his clothes. What's funny is that I actually prefer the CW show's method of depicting these rules, which is that they elect to basically ignore them for convenience sake. In the first episode, Barry burns his jacket, and there are a few more times throughout the early episodes where he runs into this problem, but for the rest of the show, he doesn't ever seem to have a problem with it. I don't know, maybe Cisco rigged him up some kind of specialized outfits, or maybe the show just forgot. Either way, I think I would rather the show just outright ignore the fact that it's an issue rather than play at pretending to address it and then ultimately contradicting itself when it suits the writer's needs. At least on the show, when dealing with whether or not Barry can move people at super speed, they decided instead to just say it's not a big deal rather than establish it as a rule and then lazily work around it after the fact when it became inconvenient. The only time in the Arrowverse I can think of where him moving someone at hyperspeeds is ever an issue is the running gag where Diggle throws up every time it happens to him. But seeing as Diggle is the only person this seems to happen to, I just assumed he was the exception, not the rule. In the opening sequence of the movie, there's a part where he has to save a bunch of babies, a nurse, and a dog who are all falling from a collapsing hospital wing, and the way they decide to work around this issue is by having Barry put one of the babies in a microwave and line them all up so that he can catch them as they fall and place them on a gurney. I'm not really sure what the writers think is the meaningful difference here between this solution and simply moving them himself, though. Either way, they're still falling at high speeds and anything they hit is going to have a significant impact. To us, this is slow motion, but in real time, this baby just basically fell into a microwave, and then that microwave fell onto the gurney, all at the speed that the baby would be falling to the ground, which means that baby is definitely dead. And two of the other babies get moved around like rag dolls, so I'm not sure what I'm meant to make of that. It looks like he's whipping them around pretty harshly, so those babies are definitely dead. And finally, this nurse fell all the way from this floor into Barry's arms, which means she's definitely dead. It would have been better and easier just to not establish this rule. I know it's consistent with the Snyder Cut, but it's also inconsistent with two other films that came out before that, which means you're gonna contradict either way, so you might as well go with the easier one to write for. Now, the essential premise for this movie is, of course, Flashpoint, because God forbid we make a Flash movie with one of his hundreds of other comic storylines. Let's just reuse the same one we've already done to death in various other media. Barry realizes he can affect the flow of time to go save his mother, but he also understands that there are certain risks that need to be accounted for. Of course, Barry's understanding of how time travel works is confusing, to say the least. It's really hard to get a grasp of what he knows, and it's only made worse by the fact that, like I already said, the actual rules of time travel as explained in this film are completely different than what you'd typically see in media. So let's break this down step by step, starting with Barry. Now, it almost feels condescending to explain what the butterfly effect is, but I'm going to anyway because I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. And we know Barry knows what it is because he refers to it by name when talking to Bruce, but he very clearly doesn't understand the logistics of it because when he's planning out how he's going to do it, his main concern is that he wants to keep interaction with other people at a minimum to avoid catastrophic damage to the timeline. He seems to believe that nothing bad will happen as long as he doesn't interact with anyone, even if he changes events. Of course, that just isn't how it works. Changing even one thing, no matter how small, would invoke the butterfly effect. That's why it's called that. It's the idea that you step on a butterfly and you can change the entire course of history, that every single detail of chronology, no matter how seemingly minute, has a significant effect in the long run. But even though he's supposed to be a genius, this is what Barry decides to do to ensure the safety of the time-space continuum. On the day that Nora died in this universe, she went to the store that morning but forgot to buy a can of tomatoes. Later, when she's making dinner, she realizes she needs 2 cans for the dish she's making but only has 1, so she asks Henry to run to the store and get another. While he's out and Barry's up in his room playing, she's murdered by some unknown, unseen assailant, and Henry gets there just too late. Present-day Barry figures that if Henry had been there, he'd have been able to stop whoever it was that killed Nora, and to avoid interacting with other people, he figures the safest possible solution would be to run back to that morning and put a can of tomatoes in his mom's shopping cart. That way he can ensure that she has what she needs to prepare dinner that evening. Now, as a seasoned survivor of the Flash TV show and other subsequent Arrowverse spin-offs that deal in time travel, I'm pretty forgiving when it comes to blatantly ignoring the butterfly effect. Sometimes minute changes in details have drastic consequences to the present, and sometimes they change nothing at all. Sometimes the legends will come along and alter events so drastically that history should be irreparably damaged, and then everything turns out fine after all said and done.
As in seducing the Queen of France just before she's supposed to conceive the country's greatest hope for the future?
She seduced me.
Actually, come to think of it, that's most episodes of Legends of Tomorrow. But what I'm highlighting here isn't that the logistics of time travel don't make sense, because again, we'll get to that later. I'm simply calling Barry an idiot for being concerned about damaging the timeline via the butterfly effect, but not seeming to understand that by dropping that can of tomatoes in his mom's cart, he's doing exactly that, regardless of whether or not he interacts with anyone. Someone else would have originally bought that can of tomatoes, or maybe it expired and was thrown out. Either one of those outcomes is going to cause a change in events, no matter how small, and the point of the butterfly effect is that those small changes make big ripples over time. But of course, that's ignoring the larger point anyway, which is that by dropping that can of tomatoes into the cart, Barry has successfully stopped his mother from dying, which means she continues to live and be part of her son's life. Henry never goes to jail, and Barry has a normal, happy childhood. Her simply being there is going to completely shift the course of history in extremely significant ways, to the point where the present day would become entirely unrecognizable to Barry. So it doesn't matter if Barry doesn't interact with anyone, he still just changed everything. Hopefully this isn't a timeline where Steppenwolf finds the mother boxes and tries to destroy Earth, because there might not have been a Flash around to stop him. In fact, we know there wouldn't have been, because had our Barry not intervened, the Barry of this timeline wouldn't have been where he needed to be to get struck by the lightning, so he couldn't have ever become the Flash. And it sure would suck if the Flash ended up being the only reason the Justice League was able to stop Steppenwolf and save the world, otherwise Barry might have just doomed everyone to save his mom. More on that later. Anyway, once he puts the tomatoes in the cart, he runs back into the Speed Force and is on his way to present day, but then he's pushed out by an unknown speedster and finds himself outside his parents' house. He meets an alternate version of himself who grew up with his mom and finds out that alternate Barry is 18 and that they're in the year 2013. For the sake of clarity, I'm going to nickname each Barry because we follow them for the rest of the movie. I was originally going to go with Tweedledee and Tweedledum, but I couldn't figure out which one was Tweedledum. So instead we're going to No Way Home this shit and just do Barry 1 and Barry 2. So the way Barry 1 explains the situation to Barry 2 implies that he believes Barry 2 is a past version of himself, meaning that once he returns to his present, he and Barry 2 will be one and the same, despite the fact that he comes from a timeline wherein his mother's been dead for 18 years, and Barry 2 grew up with his mom still alive, thereby making them entirely different people with different histories. Barry 2 had a mom to be there for him for all the birthdays and graduations, and Barry 1 grew up with no parents, all alone in the world. Even if Barry were to get back to the present day, Barry 2 would still exist and would just be the same age as him, because that's how alternate timelines work. Like, I'm having trouble figuring out how to put this explanation into words, because this is just a very basic concept that I figured everyone understood. He realizes that today is the date that he got his powers in the original timeline, and thinks that if he doesn't get Barry 2 to the lab where he was struck by lightning, that it will mean he loses his powers, but that's just not true. Whatever happens to Barry 2 has no effect on Barry 1, as is actually proven by the end of this film, and as was just plainly obvious from the get-go. I'm not sure why Barry is so much of an idiot that he doesn't understand this. But even putting all that to the side, like I've continued to allude to throughout this part of the video, the understanding of time travel that I and many others had going into this film is not the one the movie decided to go with, so even though I take issue with Barry not understanding these very basic concepts, despite ostensibly being really smart, it's still not an issue with the actual logistics of time travel, just with the intellect of our main character. However, now it's time to explain to you what this film decided to go with regarding time travel. So throughout the first half of the film, Barry attempts to locate the other members of the Justice League to help them stop Zod, and he discovers a few things that aren't the way they should be. Evidently, Arthur Curry was never born because his father never met Queen Atlanta. Superman is nowhere to be found because, as we learn later, his pod was intercepted by Zod before ever reaching Earth and he was killed as a baby. And Batman is now Michael Keaton instead of Ben Affleck, meaning that he was born several years earlier than his alternate timeline self. And of course, this doesn't make any sense to Barry because all of these things shouldn't have been affected if we were going by the standard time travel rules, because they would be events that took place before his mom's death. By my math, she would have died in the year 2004, and the circumstances surrounding Aquaman's birth would surely have happened well before that. Additionally, DCEU Bruce Wayne was born in the 70s and Clark arrived on Earth in the 80s, which means those things should still have happened regardless of Barry's changes to the timeline. The explanation the film provides us is actually one that I don't take much issue with in concept, though I definitely think it could have been handled better. Basically, they find Michael Keaton living as a hermit at his manor, and he explains to them that when you change events at a certain point in time, you're not actually creating a new timeline, but essentially just jumping to a different one entirely. Meaning that somewhere out there in the multiverse, there was a point in the timeline where Nora Allen bought that can of tomatoes and was therefore spared from her fate, but that timeline exists independently of the one Barry's from, and has an entirely different past than the one in his universe. A past where Superman never made it to Earth, and Bruce Wayne was born in the 50s and became Batman in the 80s. As best I can tell from the way this film explains time travel is that you can't actually change the past necessarily. You can just travel to a different universe where things play out more to your liking. But the timeline where Nora dies is still out there, and from the perspective of anyone there who knows Barry, he would have just up and disappeared one day without a trace. And the explanation could have been worded better because, for one thing, they have Bruce Wayne explaining it, which feels pretty odd. I wasn't aware Batman was some kind of expert in the field of quantum mechanics. But then again, maybe he's not, because he also uses the term retrocausal, which has absolutely nothing to do with what I've just described to you and only serves to muddy the waters and confuse anyone who's actually paying attention to what's being said, in an attempt to sound smart so that the explanation seems more plausible. It's essentially that Rick and Morty joke about how putting the word quantum in front of something that sounds sci-fi doesn't actually make it a real thing. And when I heard him say this, it caused me to not understand what the film was actually trying to tell me. But really, this just reads to me like Endgame coming up with their own time travel rules so they can have the payoffs that they want to have. But I will say that at least here it made some sense. Actually, if I'm going to compare it to any Marvel film, this movie tried so hard to capitalize on what made people love No Way Home, and just like in that film, it contrived a way to make that happen. But The Flash misunderstands what made No Way Home so special to so many people, because it wasn't just nostalgia for the sake of it. You can say whatever you want about the actual plot of that movie, and there are certain callbacks in it that serve only to be hollow references.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
But there are also plenty of meaningful payoffs to be found for each of the Spider-Man franchises. One of the best scenes in the whole movie is when the three Peters first meet on the rooftop and the two older Spider-Men impart their wisdom in the wake of Aunt May's death. We get a really great speech from Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man about the risks of letting anger fill your heart and being consumed by tragedy. He gets his moment to redeem himself later on, but that speech alone convinced me that there's a universe out there somewhere where the Amazing Spider-Man films were actually good. But I can't think of a single reason why someone who grew up on the Tim Burton Batman films would be satisfied with the way he was depicted here. And I'm not just talking about the fact that they made him a sad loser hiding away in his mansion, because that could have worked just fine. Apparently Gotham has become one of the safest places in the world to live in, which is making him feel pretty obsolete. Although for some reason, when asked by Barry if he'll help them take on Zod, he refuses, and I have no idea why. Like, you'd think the fact that he feels useless might be all the more reason why he'd want to go help save the world, but apparently even though the human race will be destroyed should our heroes fail, he's cool with just doing nothing, I guess. And then when he does decide to help out, they go to a Siberian prison to break out Superman, but instead of Clark, they find Supergirl, so Bruce is just like, oh well, and is about to leave her there before Barry protests that they need to save her. I don't know about you guys, but that doesn't sound very Batman to me. There's also a part where they go to where Zod is engaged in combat with the military, and the army men start shooting at the Batwing, and Bruce makes a comment about how these are the humans we're trying to save. Like, I would expect Supergirl to say something like that, since she's the one being characterized as jaded toward humanity for locking her up, but not Batman. I have a hard time believing Bruce doesn't know what it's like to operate outside the law and have authorities firing on him for his crimes as a vigilante, but he understands that that's part of the job and continues to assist the police anyway. Like, this is pretty standard Batman stuff. And then the icing on the cake comes when Bruce decides to kamikaze into a Kryptonian ship and literally kills himself in vain because the ship was shielded. So then Barry runs back in time and reverses his death by telling him that the ship is shielded, so he moves on to a different target and dies anyway, like 3 minutes later. Here in a minute, we're going to circle back to the logistics of time travel rules again, but put a pin in that because I'm not done talking about Batman yet. Yeah, Batman dies twice in this movie, and rather unceremoniously both times. This second time, he decides to fight against the Kryptonian giant from Man of Steel, and while it does eventually kill him, he manages to hold his own against it for quite a bit of time and deals some fairly significant damage in the process. Which is something I take issue with because we've seen how strong these Kryptonians are. Obviously, they're strong. And the final battle of this film has a larger issue with nerfing them, but it's especially noticeable when Batman, a regular-ass dude, is able to do anything against one of the strongest among them. And just in case any of you needed a reminder, this is what happens when a younger, stronger, and better-equipped version of Batman fights a Kryptonian at full power. It doesn't exactly go well for him. And that's with an armored suit with enhanced strength, so I refuse to believe this Batman dealt any significant damage here, which means, yet again, he died in vain. And we get a moment where he dies in Barry's arms, and it's supposed to mean something, I guess. Barry says he needs to bring him back, and Bruce says that he already has, which might have actually been impactful had we understood why he refused to join the fight to begin with. And if you weren't already insulted by this film's cheap attempt to make you feel something, they start to play a soft piano rendition of his iconic theme. Because that's all they do with him this entire movie, just nostalgia baiting and key jangling galore. Hey look, it's the Batmobile! Oh, is that the fucking laughing bag from Joker's death scene? That's neat! You wanna get nuts? Let's get nuts!
You wanna get nuts? Let's get nuts.
Which was done way better in the Lego Batman movie, and you should all go watch that instead, because it actually bothers to tell a meaningful story in its own right and doesn't just rely on your nostalgia for the old movies. But like I said, I don't want to skip past this part because the way in which the two Barrys time travel here doesn't fit with the rules we established earlier. After Bruce's first death, as well as Kara's, they both run into the Speed Force and go back a few minutes so that Barry 1 can tell Bruce to abandon the kamikaze, and Barry 2 can try to prevent Kara from getting killed by Zod. This isn't simply an example of them rewinding time like in the Snyder Cut. We see them next to their past selves, which means that they're actually traveling back in time. But since earlier we established that that causes you to jump into an alternate universe, I'm not sure how that's supposed to work. This is where the final battle completely falls apart, as if it wasn't already horrible, because then the Barrys keep on running back into the Speed Force and altering the past to try to achieve the desired outcome, and I'm just confused by this because I was led to believe that it doesn't work like that. It looks like whatever they're doing is causing universes to collide, which is what causes that soulless cameo fest that everyone and their mom have been rightfully complaining about on Twitter. So I guess that's the film acknowledging this and saying that they're not supposed to be doing it, which is all well and good, but I'm arguing that it shouldn't even be possible given the rules established. The underlying theme of Barry's arc in this movie is that he needs to move on, with Nora's death representing his clinging to the past and unwillingness to let go. I know this because the film goes out of its way to make it as explicit as possible that that's what the theme is, even flashing back to an earlier part of the movie where Nora tells Barry that not every problem has a solution, which causes him to realize that no matter how many times they try, they can't stop this world from being destroyed, and that the only way to put things right will be to right his wrongs and let his mom die. I guess it wouldn't be The Flash if they didn't overtly flash back to earlier scenes as their reference, just to make sure the subtleties aren't lost on the audience. The other Barry ends up serving as a mirror reflection of himself, who represents what he will become if he continues to obsess over things that he can't control. He continues to try to save Kara even after Barry 1 tells him what he needs to do, which of course he's not going to accept because that would mean the death of his own mother. So he continues to try again and again for an absurdly long amount of time until eventually he turns into this creepy demonic speedster villain that showed up at earlier points of the film. I mean, it was pretty obvious from the get-go that we were savataring this, and I won't pretend it's not a neat idea anyway. Having Barry take a good look at the monster he's created and could become if he doesn't learn to accept the things that can't be changed. It's nothing particularly outstanding outstanding, and like I said, the execution could use just a touch of subtlety, but the concepts are there. I just don't see why we even needed a speedster villain in this third act. We already had an external conflict with Zod, and we had our internal conflict with Barry coming to terms with what he needs to do to put things right. If you cut out Dark Flash and just rework the script a little bit, you could do away with all this unnecessary shit. Hell, you could still even have Barry 2 turn on him after finding out what he intends to do, and right there you have your speedster villain, as well as keeping that mirror reflection of Barry I was talking about a second ago. But anyway, like I said, the different universes are colliding now, so it's time for some cheap cameos, baby! Bad CGI aside, I don't really mind most of these, but where I draw the line is resurrecting dead actors and using their likenesses to recreate them just to show up for 5 seconds in your horseshit movie. Christopher Reeve, a beloved and iconic actor who touched so many people's lives as Superman, gets ripped from his grave and thrown onto the big screen to don the cape one more time in the most vacuous and hollow way possible. Have some fucking shame, you crusty, overgrown fungus of a movie studio. We've been seeing the potential pitfalls of over-reliance on this de-aging deepfake technology in the movie industry for a while now, as well as what it can mean for the larger context of today's culture, but I don't know if I've ever been quite so insulted as seeing this image on my screen. This and the new Secret Invasion show using AI to create their intro sets a dangerous precedent that I'm not happy about at all. Fuck Warner Brothers. Like I said, I'm never paying for another one of their products again, and neither should you. So the last bit of time travel mumbo-jumbo that we have to go over is after Dark Flash is defeated, Barry runs back in time to that grocery store, has one last conversation with his mom, and puts that can of tomatoes back on the shelf. I will say that this scene is one of the two throughout the entire film that I actually thought was pretty good. I could nitpick a few things, like the fact that he goes into super speed mode right in front of her, which causes bursts of lightning around him that regular people are able to notice, and in fact that very same thing happens earlier in this movie. But all in all, this scene was pretty heartfelt and capped off Barry's arc in a pretty nice and meaningful way. Now there might be a small chance that I just have a soft spot for Barry and Nora Allen, considering their relationship in the TV show is one of the only aspects that I will never criticize, but I just think the relationship between these two characters is the strongest part of an otherwise catastrophic failure of a film. The only other good scene is one that also hinges on this relationship, and it's the one where Barry 1 dresses down Barry 2 for essentially taking their mom for granted all these years. Like I said, this movie went through multiple iterations, and it's scenes like these that make me think that once upon a time there might have actually been something special about this film. It's just too bad that we're never gonna see that. Anyway, back to the time travel stuff. He puts the can of tomatoes back on the shelf, but then he looks up at the security camera and gets an idea. If I could roll us back all the way to the beginning of this film, we learned that there was a security camera pointed directly at the aisle where the tomatoes would have been located, meaning that it would have picked up Henry at the store at the time of his wife's murder, thereby exonerating him of the crime. However, the camera was old and the footage made it too hard to tell its contents, so during the initial trial it was unusable. That was until Bruce came along and used Wayne technology to enhance the footage, which they would then play at Henry's appeal that was coming up, and hopefully finally get him out of prison after all these years. But when the footage got back to Barry, he saw that Henry never looked up, and so the camera never caught his face, meaning that the footage would essentially be worthless. So as he's back in that grocery store putting the tomatoes back where they belong, he decides to place them all on the top shelf so that when Henry comes to pick them up later, the camera will get a clear view of his face. Alrighty then, so if this film were operating on the standard time travel rules, then this probably would have been perfectly fine. The camera footage would have been useless until present day anyway, which means this likely wouldn't have changed anything at all. However, since the film decided it didn't want to play by those rules, this isn't a harmless change, as Barry should damn well know. By doing this, he's entered into an alternate reality with differences to the past, which ultimately results in George Clooney replacing Ben Affleck as the DCEU Batman, for whatever that'll end up being worth. I'm not exactly sure what else there is even to come in this franchise, so who knows if this will actually mean anything. But as per the rules established, Barry has now hopped universes again. He didn't actually do anything to help his dad. He just fucked off to an alternate reality where Henry was absolved of his crimes, abandoning the one in his own timeline to rot in a cell for the rest of his days with nobody left to care for him because Barry Allen no longer exists. Speaking of which, shouldn't this mean there's another Barry hanging around somewhere, or did the movie just completely forget its own rules again? Oh, fuck it, who cares? Oh, and by the way, guys, remember, this is part of the Snyderverse canon, not the DCEU, and do you know what that means? It means Darkseid is coming, baby. It means the nightmare sequence at the end is supposed to be the future of this timeline. Only I guess now Barry won't be there for that because he's off in some alternate universe palling around with his dad and George Clooney. But wait a minute, isn't he the one who goes back in time and tells Bruce that Lois is the key? Isn't his existence in the nightmare future kind of pivotal to the progression of this timeline? It doesn't matter anymore anyway. Like I said, what even is there left of this dead franchise? It was never good to begin with, but the last several years completely killed it, and now they're rebooting with James Gunn at the helm. I suppose that's promising. I mean, even in this shit-ridden sandbox, he's been able to produce some pretty great stuff, but unfortunately I have no love for Warner Bros. And my investment in anything DC is at an all-time low. We'll see what they do with it, I guess, but that's all I can really say for now. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all when you're fast asleep tonight. Goodbye.